Welcome to this TOK video production of an analysis of the quest for the scepter of UTUA, thoughts about what it means, why we did it, and what it represents going forward. So the quest for the scepter of UTUA, quest here is going to be a reference for a straightforward test and quest archetype. Meaning that this is going to be embodied in a particular way in which individuals operate, and particularly this is situated for young boys into men, individuals at the level of, say, 8 to 11. Indeed, this emerges the idea emerges from a comment of my brother Tim, who has 3 boys that were about 7 to 12 or so at this time. And Tim had asked me, he's like, well, what is your garden theory really all about? And it's as much a new way to think about knowledge in relationship to how it's presented and educated as it is sort of in terms of its content. In other words, the whole process of turning the tree of knowledge system into a garden was an artistic calling that I now realize was an expression of the meta-modern sensibility of sincere irony. It also was an idea that the future of the digital virtual world was going to fundamentally transform the ways in which we thought about knowledge. The nature of the bridge in the garden is a conciliant bridge that cultivates a more effective dance between the sciences and humanities. It's also the case that the garden is really designed in a particular way, or it is envisioned a design. It's a prototype of a design that allows for an educational sequence that is much more intuitive and embodied, that then sets the stage for the kinds of experiences that could cultivate an entire educational development. For example, I was talked with my mom and an art professor friend of mine. We talked about the possibility of building a nursery school that had many themes of the garden around it in terms of, say, a playground or many activities that would have garden themes. So you could develop a whole prototype of a preschool that has as its mission or frame or way of being. And so now this moves up into middle school, late, elementary school, middle school, early middle school, and it has an archetype for boys here. That's in part because my brother has 3 boys, and I was oriented. It's also, there's a larger message here that I think that the educational system is failing us miserably. The psychological theorist Zach Stein talks about the collapse of teacherly authority. I think that there are crises of identity. I think there are deep crises of masculinity and deep crises about how we are educating both our children in general and perhaps maybe even in particular our boys. So this is a response to show how the system sets the stage for a novel approach to education. What would an education be like that was more oriented toward sort of the archetypal interests of boys? Another thing that certainly triggered this was watching my own son play video games endlessly, and to play with him in terms of we spent many hours playing Diablo together, or sports games. Those they're naturally inclined to a particular investment domains, and there are benefits to that, I think, video games, and I think there are also some real costs. So then the question would be, could you actually build a system of understanding that would enable people to enjoy it, to people to feel invested in it, activate core archetypes in a particular way, and then set the stage also for a deep embodied embedded learning experience. And so we, of course, The scepter, as you'll see, sort of an archetypal symbol of nobility, of warrior nobility, and it's going to then kind of pull for both a priest and warrior identity here, one that then connects to the uniqueness of the self. So I'm pulling for archetypal masculine energy in relationship to this, and I'm speaking both to the priest and theorist that then sort of has a wizard and mage notion, as well as a warrior weapon. So it's pulling on both of those. And we're going to then connect that to the unique power of the individual in the form of a spirit object. And I want to say, although I'm talking about it in terms of some masculine, of course, everybody has masculine and feminine energy in relation. Certainly, or yin yang energy. And so this is certainly not something that is strongly sexed in that regard, but it is weakly so, and it's important to identify this story as such. And of course, we're going to then make the trip into the garden, UTUA, of course, standing for a Unified Theory of Psychology, Unified Approach to Psychotherapy, the way I referred to the system for the period maybe between 2015 to 2018-19, as I played around with how to get the, what now I refer to as U-Talk, or the Unified Theory of Knowledge. And then we have, as you'll see, the cave of the mind's eye. That will become pretty apparent, and its connection to both riding the TOK, and we'll explain what the surfboard is here. There's a private story associated with the troll that I won't get into. We'll talk a little bit about the sailing between the Anaconda sisters. Then there's the dragon, which I'll spend some time discussing, the 4P clover fairies, Princess Hope, and the good wizard Waldemar, who is an archetypal wise figure to be representing the sage that guides the youth on their quest. So we start in the world of UTUA, and I'm going to then make a connection to life quest, life world. This is the more subjective first-person perspective on being here, and I'm going to kind of connect. This is an allusion, a reference to thinking about what's your life world, life quest. And so now wake up to the world that you're in, and then are we going to be oriented to a particular noble quest of realizing that. And now we look out and we see there's trouble in the land. And this trouble is the orange dragon Trumperton. And of course, we immediately know what we're referring to here. And awakened by the fire in the center at the Blue Church. And this caused by a destructive conflict. And then in frustration, the townspeople repeat his name too many times. So, why Trump? Why bring politics into this? And what am I doing here in relationship to the Blue Church? Well, the Blue Church is a fairly recent reference that I've become across of in relationship to Jordan Hall, which captures the establishment. And so now, and without getting into sort of much of the symbolism here, I'm going to now connect the emergence of Trump with the failure of the Blue Church. And I'm going to position myself in this quest as being a metaphor for the characterizing the corruption of Game A. So if you're aware of the sort of meta-modern circles, you know the term Game A, which refers to competitive rivalrous control. And also it refers to the old institutional infrastructures that were operative, that are now, I believe, if you look around in terms of the confidence of our institutions and the idea that we are on a nice, healthy trajectory of progress because they're sound and integrated and effective, is obviously completely, ironically, the reverse of that. We are seeing an enormous amount of lack of confidence, a massive flux, huge amounts of uncertainty, and a kairotic moment, meaning we're a moment of massive change and transition. I see Donald Trump as, at a political level, I can understand. I'm certainly not unable to empathize and hold the space as to why many people voted for him in 2016. I really want us to move beyond the destructive political polarization, so I'm not attacking Republican conservative ideas here. And, you know, there is a sympathetic angle on Trump, which is worthy of reflecting. At the same time, the man's character is the antithesis of the direction that I believe we need to move in. He is a caricature of a consumptive, shallow, hostile man who has no intellectual integrity, no psychological reflective mindfulness, and I believe he is leaving a characterological disaster in his wake. And that is what fundamentally the message of dignity and well-being with integrity at the level of character is absolutely central to the message of the garden. And it's absolutely central that we learn that what Trump represents is a key. He's a symptom of the disease, but there are aspects of his character that exemplify the narcissistic consumerist capital disease. And I'm not saying that as anybody is saying we have to go to socialism. I'm simply saying there is a raw consumer capitalist competitive narcissistic disease that he represents. And therefore, there is havoc, there is chaos. He is suing chaos in a particular way. And granted, there is a massive amounts of transformation that's needed, meta-political, and I'm not here to defend any particular branch of government or political ideology. But we are looking out and seeing chaos, and we need a fundamentally different way to cultivate virtue. We need a fundamentally different way to educate. And so here we have the archetypal princess Hope, who spurs energy toward the positive and toward the beautiful, and is, you know, of course, a damsel in distress. Again, obviously pulling for a masculine archetype that's going to require individuals to help. And we must, to save the town, we must address this chaos of Trumperton. And we need to contact Waldemar, the forest philosopher. Now, this is a personal reference to, you know, Waldemar is going to be a Gandalf-like figure, but he's actually a friend of mine and somebody who's been part of the Theory of Knowledge Society, and I think at one time referred to himself as the forest philosopher. And he also is not a fan of Trump, not surprisingly. But now we have to then find much adversity in our test and quest, and we come to Sene, troll, and there's a little personal reference here that I won't get into, but Sene is the skeptical killjoy troll. This is the voice, very much often grounded in reality, but that is skeptical of hope and of great triumph, and requires one's constant confrontation. This is not meant. The troll here I think that's a beautiful picture myself, actually, of a cool. So although he's an irritant in a particular way, and this is minimized in that way, I do want to cultivate also a sense of respect for the troll. The troll is not fundamentally evil, but the troll is definitely something that will troll your psyche, as it were, and then potentially keep one from expressing fortitude and strength in particular ways. So he blocks your way, doubts that you have this knowledge. And now I want to tap into this is a reference now to the true self, and the process by which we can potentially cultivate, be known and valued for our true selves, is a deep message of the garden, and then to find one's own self and then have that expressed. And my hope is eventually we'll be able to build a society that maximizes the potential for that to be. And so we're going to then set up now that Waldemar has and I believe this actually is true of the person, that Waldemar has a particular way of being in the world that can pull this sort of fatherly sage-like wisdom to pull for a particular kind of cultivation and development of the true self. And of course here, then we're going to want to cultivate wisdom, be true to yourself, good to others. This is my other friend, Mike Muscola, talks about fear for self and love of the other as being a foundation, and then a wise resolution for that. That's a reference to that. So we must embark on a life quest to be better than Trumperton and to be value added in systems that do not leave the fiery chaos of a Trumperton way of being in the world, and also to navigate the skepticism, perfectionism, judgmentalness, and hold true to oneself and find the path to do so, which is, of course, not the nature of life world life quest existence. So then the spirit objects here are just designed to offer some potential reflections. The one in the middle of the tie-dye rose is when my daughter and I were working on the garden, Lainey, she fell in love for a while with tie-dye roses, and we thought about them in terms of the garden maybe flourishing with tie-dye roses, and that was a reference there. So it might be a dog, it might be a sword, whatever the spirit object is. And of course now I'm trying to cultivate an appreciation for indigenous sensibilities here as well, an appreciation for what might be a way to help us stay more embodied and connected in mystery, in liminal spaces, in indigenous traditions, in earth. And this is one of the areas that I think we're significantly underdeveloped in. So a spirit object is a particular then reference here. And notice spirit object, we're going to then connect sort of the highest transcendental aspirational aspects of our psyche into soul with the material world. So I'm actually also playing here with some dualism or bridging the traditional matter-spirit dualism. And now we sort of look to sort of the judgmental space in the culture, and then how do we express the true potential that we are and how this object represents it. And so the idea that one can do that, then one has then filtered through the public judgmental space and has, held and honored one's essence. So now we need to, now we're ready to embark. We now, yes, we've aligned sort of the moral realism of the situation is now aligned with our true self. We've connected some aspect of our spirit object, and now we are ready to link and fuse ourselves with that and cultivate the inner sage and orient towards sort of the archetype of success in achieving virtue. And now we have to find the path to get to this. And this is, of course, the challenge, which means you have to get to the river of character. To do that, you have to go up to the ocean G. And to get to the ocean G, you have to find the P300 Waverider, which is located in the cave of the mind's eye. And of course, these are two eyes that we're going to then be getting into in terms of the cave of the mind's eye. And obviously here, the illusion, which will become explicit to anybody that has background knowledge, the illusion is then going to be fundamentally our philosophical, psychological struggle of making sense out of the relationship between matter and mind. And getting some coherence in relationship between the physical and psychological. And you'll see that as implied in the journey. But to do that, we have to then first come across the eye anaconda sisters. Now, this is sort of an anaconda. An I am a con is there then a reference to both who lies and who manipulates, who turns against, how do we balance sort of the evil inclinations of self in relationship to other, how do we sail between them and be true? We're going to get pulled defensively and we'll get wrapped up, we'll get strangled by the potential, the anaconda squeeze. So to get to insight, one of the things that we're going to have to do is come to terms with some of the darker aspects of our nature. And here we have the troll saying, you know, you'll never wake up and realize the path. But Waldemar there is knowledge that it's difficult, but there is a way. And we have to get to the sprites here because they carry a particular kind of sensitive feminine wisdom that we will both assist with but benefit from. And we will then have to go to the forest and explore and look with both care and honesty about our various domains, and hopefully then with luck we will succeed in cultivating a sense of understanding that then can navigate the Anaconda sisters. They themselves are struggling and we have to come together to struggle. They've lost their charm, which is a 4P clover. Okay. Now the 4 Ps here are actually philosophy, physics, political science, and psychology, and they represent basically the wish to make sense out of the world across those different domains. They found a key to do that, but actually they have lost it. And the individual now needs to seek understanding across a very complex set of notions and arrive at them. But if you look long enough in the UTUA forest, you find the particular charm. And now, because this embodies, then the fairies are happy with you, you feel connected to that inner quest of the dark night of the soul and make sense out of that. You now have a magical archetype to connect to in relation. We then can see that we now need to confront the fairies. And to do that, we're going to then say Ubuntu Atua, Ubuntu. Now, Ubuntu is a African philosophy that means basically through you, me and us together. It's basically very much unlike sort of an individualistic tradition in the West. It fuses self and other together, shows sort of the need for mutual relational value, to use a term, but basically a need to recognize the value in the other and how that feeds back on the self, and then together you move toward humanity. It's also the case that Ubuntu, as I heard about the philosophy for the first time, I was at a conference at Cultivating the Globally Sustainable Self, and it was as I heard Ubuntu that oriented me toward thinking about the idea of UTUA as a garden. And it was because it was really that African word, and I appreciated of that. It also then it started to trigger the return to Eden, that I was ready to return to Eden on the journey, having found the tree of knowledge, and then got called to return and ultimately construct the garden of UTUA. So Ubuntu UTUA's got lots of different meanings. We are now looking at the selfish twin sisters of I am a con, and the process by which there are self-deceptions in relationship to the mind. We then drop a set of understandings that is both kind of magical but also logos, sort of a mythos here of what's the myth, and then connect it also to things like physics and psychology through philosophy and political science. That's all a connection then to the various layers and domains of knowing at the individual level, at the political level, at the deep value philosophical level, all the way down to the physics level, and create coherence. And it is that coherence that then allows us to gain integrity and to see what's true, good, true, and beautiful, and then potentially enter the domain of the mind, where we're going to then retrieve a P300 Waverider. Okay. So now we enter into the cave of the mind's eye, which now becomes, of course, Plato's allegory of the cave. And this is then the classic philosophical notion that the world is filled with appearances that really are shadows on the wall. Most individuals are chained to those perceptions that they're handed by their society and that they simply see every day and assume to be real. But actually, there is a real outside world. Those are simply shadows based on what people are taught to believe, and with reflection and understanding and philosophy, we can achieve insight in relationship to that. Now, the insight in relationship to the P300 Waverider, okay, is going to bring us from this domain of analysis of the mind to a much more modern conception of the mind. And this is sort of modern global neuronal workspace theory. Specifically, I read a book called Consciousness in the Brain by Dehane, who was doing brilliant work on identifying conscious access points, and identified an ignition wave between the parietal and frontal lobes that seem to be associated with, or were associated with, the time in which an image would, say, flash at a subliminal level. Say if it flashed for 1/10 of a second, it would not be registerable. But after it gets about 150, 200, and then certainly really regularly by the time you're at 300 milliseconds, there is a building wave and then what he calls an ignition wave between the parietal and frontal lobes that is highly correlated with the experience of consciousness, and when you can then have conscious access to say, yes, I see that object. Now your brain is processing the information prior to that and starting to draw hypotheses, make connections, but there is awareness that's associated with about 300 milliseconds. And so this is to spark the ignition switch in your mind. Okay, so now we've dug deep into the cave of the mind's eye, and we're sparking that ignition switch. But to actually achieve insight, okay, we're now going to go back to the cave, and now we have the brain, and we have insight from philosophy, and then we're going to play the Inside Out game. Now, Inside Out, as you may recall, was a popular movie by Disney, and it was a personification of the emotions and how they could be seen. So we're going to now play with subjectivity and objectivity. We're also going to play with phenomenology and behavior here. And we'll ask the question, well, what do you see when you see a table? Okay, which sounds pretty straightforward, but then we realize, wait a minute, what do you mean? There's this inside world of the table and the outside world. There's also then the physical world of atoms. There's the idea of the table. There's what's going on then inside your body, specifically brain and nervous system. There's the experience of inside the head. There's the narrative that says, I see the table. There's the actions that we can take. And so this is basically just delineating the basic metaphysical concepts that ultimately comes the map of mind 1, 2, 3, which then we will tie together. But we're just going to be asking an 8 to 12-year-old to be able to at least see, yes, I could identify these various domains. And then ask the question, wait a minute, where's the table existing? And then realize, oh my gosh, there's the outside world and the inside world. Isn't that cool? And isn't that weird? And then how do we actually sort out the relationship between both? Is, of course, then one of the great questions of the cave of the mind's eye and the outer reality and their relation. But doing so then ignites the Waverider. Okay, so now basically we now have insight. We've created a conscious access loop to a piece of information that then connects insight at the linguistic level with the perceptual insight with the external world, and that all of a sudden brings a degree of synthesis. And now what happens is you then place that Waverider on top of a wave that you then ride. Now, those that are familiar with the tree of knowledge, I would often say ride the wave, and this was an image that I would have, would be a man, and you'll notice the man's got a surfboard rider, has 4 different cones on him, which of course represents the TOK cones. And he is now riding his consciousness above the wave that goes from matter, life, mind, and culture, now is then finding the 5th joint point and riding the wave on top of that. It's also very useful here to note the ocean G is a reference here to cultivating a particular kind of trait-based character identity. Ocean is the 5 traits of openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and neuroticism. And G is, of course, sort of intellect. We know that there's actually a particular kind of role model personality that's moderately high on O, C, E, and A, and moderately low on N. That's a type. And cultivating intelligent kids that have role model personalities is a good frame of reference for what kind of developmental experiences are we after. And then we can ask, well, how do we get to those developmental experiences? Well, we start to look for the HER-DJ river of character. Of course, these are then the character adaptation systems of habits, emotions/experiential system, relationships, relational system, the defensive system, and justification. And this then is the network of systems of adaptation that then build character. When you then drive up and say, okay, well, how am I going to get to there? We're going to then bring our consciousness and hop it onto the wheel of development, the center of which are CAS, the character adaptation systems, and then the other domains are traits, identity, values and virtues, abilities and talents, and challenges and pathologies. And this raft of development that will spin and cultivate the various domains takes the individual down into a place of cultivation up through the trials and tribulations of life, and now hopefully cultivating the kind of character that is worthy. And so we travel up these stones, and now our time is to get to, okay, we've now developed enough insight, hardship, we have activated our true self, and now we're actually ready to encounter the garden. And so here is the stepping stone, which is now into the material world, but is then about ready to ground us from the material world into the portal. And so now the portal is the garden. This is, in the original depiction, I did not have the iQuad coin, but of course I can add it now. So here we have the human identity function is the rotation on the coin. This then activates the quadratic, at least metaphorically, and the human identity function that then places the individual in the epistemological quadrants afforded by Wilber into the quadratic of matter, life, mind, and culture, and then places you in the cosmic coordinates, and then you flip the coin and connect now all of a sudden into the metaphysical space of the garden, and most notably the tree, connecting most directly to the metaphysical empirical flower in the center, and then the 8 flowering branches or apples off the tree. And then now with that rotation, we can now see the flicker of the garden. But there is a gate, and to get, we have to think about being worthy and virtuous. And the garden certainly sort of embraces this idea that, yeah, this is a value-based system. And while certainly it's not definitive in terms of these are the only values in the way they have to be framed, it's an integrated plural meta-value system that embraces a certain set of values that then are seen as part of what would be the larger macro meta set of values that guide people in the world, and these can be found with tremendous degree of reliability across the various wisdom traditions that emerged in the axial age. That would be things like the deep values in Hinduism or Confucianism and Taoism, Judeo-Christian, Islamic, Abrahamic traditions, the Greco-Roman traditions, Zoroastrianism. The Baha'i faith provides an interesting perspective on seeing how these can be integrated. There are a wide variety of different angles on this. And for the reference to the garden, we have the WKID, which is basically a good soul, but somebody, a creature that emphasizes the need for structure and character. And so we get a glimpse of the garden of UTUA here. But the WKID on the outside is a worker bee that's wondering whether or not, you're sort of fully ready to enter. And so we're going to start with 4 words to consider: wisdom, interest, character, and well-being. Wisdom is going to be knowledge and practice toward valued ends. Interests are going to be defined in terms of resources, needs, desires of self, other, and the world. Development, character is about development and adaptation of personality and virtue. And finally, well-being is going to be happiness with the worthiness to be happy. And these are sort of the 4 pillars that the WKID represents its cultivation of. And these are in fact inscribed on its back as follows. And in terms of cultivating practical wisdom, I took a symbol of the National Honor Society that my kids belonged in. I transformed that into a symbol here where you have wisdom and then underneath that, the symbols for dignity, well-being, and integrity. And that's what the sort of fundamentally think about this is sort of like, yeah, are you a member of the good society here? Do you have honor and integrity? Do you cultivate well-being and work for what's good? Do you have dignity and respect and appreciation for aesthetics? And so these are the questions then that the WKID encourage you to wonder in terms of each one of these 4 branches. What do you understand in general? And then how do you apply it to yourself? Where are you in relationship to these domains? And if these domains can be held and represented, then indeed you are appropriately connected to the meta values of the garden. And the gate opens. And then we get a basic, the classic representation that's in the big picture behind me. And share a little bit about the wicked WISM bee, which is cultivating wise sense and meaning making. And of course, this is the data, information, knowledge, wisdom continuum, with the tree of knowledge placing us really in terms of cosmic coordinates at the 5th joint point. And so in terms of wisdom of the future and reflection on that, how do we cultivate the knowledge from the tree of knowledge system and then work together to cultivate the proper practices and put those together and be on the path toward valued states of being in the 21st century. And then the back half of the B is holistic intersubjective mental behavior, and that is a nod to the quadrants. And so we have here sort of the epistemological aspects of the B, as well as some other sort of structures for understanding knowledge. And together, the wicked wisdom bee is more the knowledge construction and dissemination bee. The WKID, the more structure foundation building. One is being more analytical, pure reason, and the other is more practical reason and embodiment. And of course, that aligns with the idea that once the unified theory of psychology, okay, what are the structures that describe and explain? And once the unified approach, what are the structures that we can draw from that to use to cultivate effective adaptive development and well-being with a sophisticated, mindful approach toward valued states. And we can then sort of now map the domains of the tree. Okay, so you have the classic 4 words with the 8 keywords representing each branch. So these are the 8 key ideas. explored. And then we have the organization of the tree, fundamentally pulling together in its new unified theory of knowledge, filling together metaphysics and empirical investigation into a conciliant picture. And we have the big ME, little me meme, as well as the dialectic between metaphysical and empirical. And here, of course, is the unified theory, the unified approach, theory of knowledge, and this gives us the key elements of the UTUA TOK, which now gets just generally shortened to the UTOK tree. And then there's the stepping stone, the seed, and I have talked about these domains in other areas. This provides a map of the key domains of education and schooling, and this is also then reference that this is a new sort of theory of what education could be like in terms of how we create embodied quest in games that weave together many different domains. And then there's a reference ultimately to sort of a more complicated, radical, mathematical, humanistic frame that sets, I think, in motion a number of sort of the core metaphysics and to connect then to the physics of the system. And ultimately, to the extent that that's right, that creates a linkage of physics to metaphysics and a complete unified theory of knowledge, at least from the vantage point of which I am located. So now we kind of come back to the individuals, and we're back into, so here is, you can then play for however long you want into the cathedral or the richness of the garden. But now we're back to the task, and we have to then think about and give them, okay, yes, there's knowledge, there's justification, investment and influence, there's adaptation and development, well-being and mindfulness. And that together then is going to pull our capacity to then be handed the strength, the symbolic strength to do what is needed, and then to really make the sacrifice. You're now going to sacrifice one spirit object, okay, and transition. So now we're going to make the connection, and now you have to sort of give some aspect of yourself to be, and then to pull from this big meme, at least that's the idea, if you're going to now give, and then go back to make the necessary difference in the whole of humanity. Okay? So now you're leaving with the scepter, and then you return back to the various domains. The serpent sisters travel through. Okay, then we come back, and Sene is still being skeptical, and Waldemar is still encouraging you. And we bring the princess, and now she calls the dragon, and of course, there's references here to Trump and the history of what he, symbolized across a number of different domains. And then she uses her beauty to lure him. And then now you work together with her, and you enter. And then now there's going to be a twist in relationship to this that represents sort of a feminine heart of mind rather than sort of an ultimate masculine competitive game A. So we do not kill Trumperton, but he simply is then transformed into something that's a lot less dramatic and scary. And quite frankly, I think that there are good reasons to encourage many people who have found Trump to be sort of the epitome of evil in ways that I think are painfully exaggerated, certainly, although we are representing his character here a particular kind of way that is definitely dangerous and destructive, which I don't doubt. It's also easily a reaction, an overreaction, exaggerated reaction, a Trump derangement syndrome reaction to what he represents or the world represents, which is actually then, especially from the extreme kind of progressive perspective, in my opinion, that creates part of the sickening bipolar destructiveness that is just one of the forces that is ripping apart the Blue Church. And so we need is to give up this dominating, assertive, controlling, take a step back, have a chuckle, be less reactive, and ultimately be prepared to see good and be very hesitant to engage in fundamental action of game A, destruction or attack. Instead, emphasize the need to spread love and wisdom. And now that you have been given the strength through the scepter to cultivate your spirit object, it returns to you. And then the essence of the garden, and you are connected. Those familiar with the coin would then be able to see, okay, now this is a theme back into the I-quad side of the coin. Now the person has connected to the garden. They've used the energy of the garden to engage in good, and then they have returned with the spirit of the garden and their spirit object now yoked together. And then they are then recognized for their true exceptional selves in relationship to the sacrifices that they've made by both the archetypal feminine and archetypal masculine. And then that is then given to then feel the completion of the life world, life quest, and to be then energized toward wanting to be virtuous in the world. And that is the analysis of the quest of the garden. And so I hope folks can see how this sort of way outside the box, metamodern, sincere, ironic system then potentially sets the stage for a pretty significant transformation about what might be available to us. And then you go back and you say, well, okay, if somebody really was talented with animation and education, how could we sort of weave this through and note what kinds of things were potentially learned that were, subtly learned, and you could make them at various levels of salience. But could we weave this through in such that what would be like if a kid went to school and encountered this as the day's task, and we wove it together that way? I think that the experience could be radically different. And then if you trailed that developmentally across different stages, we could see a potential for a fundamental shift in the way in which we are socializing and educating our children. So I hope you found this to be worthwhile. I certainly enjoyed putting this together, and I look to see what future potential might be realized from it.